So, very much like to introduce you to Adam Aronovich, who's going to speak to us about psychopharmaceuticals and ethnomedicines.
Right. Hello, everybody. So I would like to start my presentation with a complaint. Okay? I want to complain. I know I just arrived, but I already have a complaint. Okay? My complaint basically is that my heart aches. I have a heartache. Now, an aching heart is a very serious thing. Okay? If I walk down from here and I just started walking around all of you, okay? And I told you, like, individually, hey, I have an aching heart, right? Or my heart aches. Then for most of you, or at least those of you who grew up in Western cultures or Westernized cultures, right? You'll probably immediately think, oh, poor guy, his girlfriend just left him, he just broke up with his wife, or he's having something off with his, romantic relationship, right? And the reason for that is that part of the heritage that we have from Romanticism in the West, right? So we consider the heart to be the symbolic center of romantic life. Right? But this is not a universal thing. If I was an Iranian woman, right, and I was not me, but an Iranian woman, and you were my girlfriends, and we were sitting not in Rio Branco, but let's say a coffee shop in Tehran, okay, and I'm like, my heart aches, then that probably would be understood in a very, very different way, right? Because you would probably interpret that more as a, a expression of affliction that is inherent to the problems of feminine sexuality in a very oppressive patriarchal society. Okay? If we traveled across the distance and we crossed the Atlantic, and now we are in the central mountains of central Mexico. This is very, very close to where I am from. Okay? And in the central mountains of Mexico, we still have today many, many, many people. There are Nahua people and Otomi people. And in many of the systematized medicines of Mesoamerica, the heart is understood to be an organ that is very, very important to the proper digestion of food, right? So if I went to the Nahua healer and they were like, hey, my heart aches, you'd probably be like, well, go to the bathroom, okay? Take a crap, come back, right? You will feel much, much, much better, right? Now, if I was riding the subway in New York, or I was in the metro in Barcelona, okay, and I cried, oh, my heart aches, then you rush over, okay? Like this guy's having a heart attack, take him to the hospital, right? So, same expression of distress, okay, but very, very different meanings depending on the cultural context in which that expression is uttered. So, one of the most important, in my opinion, one of the most important facets of psychedelic experiences, including work that we do with ethnomedicines, is that they remind us of the primacy of experience. Okay? However bizarre, dreamlike, detached from our baseline cognitive and perceptual processes these experiences may be, we tend to acknowledge their epistemological privilege. Okay? As the dimensions of social control become self-evident, it becomes increasingly difficult, right, to take seriously the official discourses on dangerous drugs. And for many of us, these non-ordinary states of awareness are not merely abnormal misfirings, neural misfirings or pathological, but actually potentially transcendental experiences brimming with meaning about our personal lives, our relationships to each other, our families, communities, and also the earth. So similar to what's happening with established drug policies, the practice of institutionalized mental health is also suffering from a crisis of confidence. And this is a crisis that is, there's abundant criticism of Western biopsychiatry, and this is coming from both sides, okay, both poles, from this almost kind of ontological schism that we have created between the experts and their patients, okay, which in many times these patients are also actually the real experts of their own experiences. So our modern psychiatric diagnostic manuals began as a classificatory botany of symptoms. Okay? In order to emulate the rest of the biomedical branches of medicine, they converted a wealth and breadth of subjective, local, particular, idiosyncratic symptoms of distress into basically supposedly universal, right, objective, observable signs. Yet what constitutes abnormal or pathological behavior, even after we acknowledge for its biological basis, it's still largely social and cultural construction. Okay? So as an ethnographic example of what I mean, we have the phenomenon of auditory hallucinations. Okay? So, well, these are popularly thought to be a universal sign of psychopathology. Actually, a majority of people all over the world will experience auditory hallucinations sometimes in their lives. And research also has shown that the content and the modality of these experiences is greatly influenced by culture. Okay? For example, among some Amerindian groups, okay, notably the Hopi people, grief, auditory hallucinations are actually an integral part of the process of coping with loss. Okay, it's a very important part of grief and mourning. So, for example, a Hopi man whose wife has just died, right? He very shortly after her death will maybe start to hear her voice, right? Like telling him all sorts of different things, like, you know, even though I'm dead, I'm still looking out for you from beyond, right? Or, well, I don't know, like, I'm dead, but the kids need to eat, so don't forget to feed the kids, right? All sorts of things that help this person cope with her death, you know, be less lonely, and maybe integrate her demise, right, and move on with his life. So if we understood the hallucinations of this man as a universal sign of psychopathology, and we insisted on pathologizing it, and we, you know, suppressed his experience with neuroleptics and antipsychotics, first of all, we would be depriving this person from a very important part of his integration process. Okay? But also, of course, we would be depriving the ethnographer from finding a very important part of this culture's worldview. The fact that diagnostic manuals group diseases by similarities, okay, but they provide basically no explanation or no etiology for them, means that they're they're easily exploitable for all sorts of means of social control. So we have also different historical examples, okay, about how this can happen. The very paradigmatic historical drapetomania. This was a diagnosis that was given back in the 19th century to African American slaves who had a pathological compulsion to constantly escape their white owners. And we have the sluggish schizophrenia label. This was a label that was basically pushed by Soviet psychiatrists, applied to political and religious dissidents, okay, who held that delusional belief that the Communist Party system was not the ideal form of government, and that maybe it would be preferable to live in a free or democratic society. We have many examples of this, and I think it is very important to be aware of what's happening today in the field of global mental health. We have globalizing programs, such as the MHGAP, the WHO Mind as well. These are programs that seek basically to extend the reach of the biopsychiatric model to non-Westernized and poor nations. But critics of these programs argue that although commonly exalted as universalist, Western biopsychiatry is actually also a cultural artifact that is born out of a very specific worldview. Okay? And being a product of Western culture, psychiatry, Western psychiatry, is inseparable from its ruling ideologies, the socioeconomic dynamics, the huge influence that the pharmaceutical industry, right, exerts on clinical practice, coupled with a highly materialistic and highly individualistic paradigm, results in a psychiatry that is highly stigmatizing. Because nowadays, most mental disease is understood as brain disease. And the main and almost exclusive tool nowadays is, of course, psychopharmaceutical treatment that is marketed as any other market commodity. Okay? But commodities need consumers, right? And markets need to expand. So as a neoliberal project, biopsychiatry is an expansive and sometimes colonial enterprise. And it is not really clear at all that these attempts to globalize mental health are in the best interest of those people I mean, if anything, it is a double-edged sword that needs to be considered in all its complexities. So as an example of what I mean, we have the example of Brazilian psychiatry that is pushing towards the medicalization of children in isolated Amazonian communities, particularly this being among the Carajá villages in the Araguaia River Valley. Now, ADHD is a very controversial diagnosis as it is. Okay? But even much more so when we acknowledge that ADHD is actually a fruit or a result of an ethnopsychiatry that is born from a culture that glorifies productivity over play, okay? A culture that promotes competition over cooperation. Okay? A culture that highly regards children who blindly submit to authority. Right? But this is not a universal set of values. Right? And sometimes it may seem that trying to promote those values by dosing children with amphetamines, I mean, the ethics of it are highly questionable. When I was a young psychology student I worked in the psychiatric hospital of Beersheba in Israel. And Israel, and Beersheba particularly, has a very large community of Ethiopian Jews. Okay? Ethiopian Jews in general in Israel are not very well integrated into Israeli society. They're highly marginalized. And in the psychiatric ward where I work, there's a large number of Ethiopian men. And many of them, actually most of them, were diagnosed with schizophrenia. Right? But when I talked to them, right, it became evident that what actually was afflicting them was something totally different. Okay? Because they said that actually they were possessed by a demon, okay, that is called Zar. Now, the Zar is cataloged today in the diagnostic manual as a culture-bound syndrome. Okay? This is already a category that points towards the ethnocentricity of Western psychiatry. Okay? And in the Horn of Africa, where Zar is actually very prevalent, the common treatment is a ritual exercise that is performed by a big chunk of that person's community. Okay? And when the Zar is treated in its traditional way, it has very good prognosis. The remission rates are very, very low. People usually get much, much better. Okay? So for these people who are treated with neuroleptics in an Israeli psychiatric ward, they didn't do nothing for them, basically because they don't have the same symbolic efficacy that a ritualized exorcism has in their own culture. So schizophrenia patients in developed nations actually have the worst prognosis and quality of life in the world. Globalizing mental health programs carry the implicit risk also of undermining this paradoxical advantage that people diagnosed with schizophrenia in poor countries seem to have over people in industrialized societies. And this is an advantage that many, many people theorize to be rooted in attentional devices that are based on collectivity and reciprocity, contrasted with this marginalizing individualization and this marginalizing individualization and loneliness that mental illness often implies in the West. This is a painting that I like very much. I found it not that long ago in the El Prado Museum in Madrid by Jerónimo Bosch. And apparently back in the 16th century, medics believed that madness was caused by a stone being lodged in the brain. Maybe this was just a metaphor that they used. But in any case, I think this picture kind of depicts perfectly this tension that exists between the localization of madness in the individual and the localization of madness in society, right? So who is the mad person in this picture? The one who's restrained, right? Or the one who's drilling a hole through the skull of this person? So who is a mad person? The one who breaks with consensus reality, or the one who seeks to maintain the illusion of order and control? The one who has funny ideas, right? Or the ones who conform to preconceived notions of normalcy and sanity, right? The ones who believe that madness was caused by a stone, or the ones that believe that madness can be cured with a pill? So ethnomedicines, I think, and psychedelics are of great value to break beyond biopsychiatry's individualization of mental illness because they show us that mad cultures and mad societies are very likely to derive in mad individuals. So gaining insights into our own cultural programming helps us to elucidate how structural violence and socioeconomic inequality, consumerism, create the sort of deeply rooted distress that is very, very unlikely to really be cured by antidepressants or antipsychotics. And plant medicines show us that imbalanced ecosystems mirror imbalanced emotions, that polluted rivers create polluted minds, create polluted rivers, and create polluted minds. So a culture of patriarchal domination, really, patriarchal domination and subjugation doesn't only affect the earth and the communities and the native communities who are at the front lines of ecocide and ethnocide, but also greatly affects the health of those of us who are actually enjoying the fruits of Western affluence. And the violence and alienation, the suppression of empathy and compassion that is required from us every day, that we turn our heads away from reality, this creates a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance, emotional, psychic suffering, sometimes drives us to travel to faraway places that we're destroying as well. So when we talk about madness, I think we should not be talking only about textbook psychosis, but about most of us living in highly industrialized, individualistic, consumerist, colonialist, extractionist, and exploitative cultures. Loneliness, in fact, is turning out to be a major contributor to psychopathology. And I'm going to finish here. I still have some slides to go, but if time's up, okay? So just this quote from Eric Fromm, which basically, millions of people sharing the same forms of mental pathology does not make those people sane. Right. Thank you.
Adam, thank you very much for that. I'd now like to invite Joe Tafur, speaking about bridging ayahuasca shamanism with allopathic medicine.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for having me here. Thank you to ICers and everyone that is here today. So this is the Psychology Public Health segment, and this is my talk, Bridging Ayahuasca Shamanism with Allopathic Medicine. So I'm a medical doctor from the United States. So 2006, completed my family medicine training at UCLA. Then I did 2 years of postdoctoral research, some academic research in UCSD psychiatry at the university there, and then at that time started getting involved in ayahuasca. From 2011 to 2016, I helped run Niuerao Centro Espiritual, which is a ayahuasca healing center, traditional Shipibo healing center in Iquitos, Peru, where we're part of the ayahuasca medical tourism that's been going on. And during that time, I trained in traditional Shipibo shamanism and then also worked there as an assistant shaman. So I'm taking this opportunity to present this book that I've written that I'm going to release in January about my experiences as a medical doctor and my exploration into traditional Amazonian plant medicine. Because, we talk about, what was just presented right now, how do we create a framework that is going to, for me as a doctor, we're treating people, we're treating individuals. We've seen hundreds of people come through the center, maybe 1,000 people have come through the center by this point, and we've seen some really impressive results in a lot of cases. So the book is about my journey from medical school to learning shamanism, and it's based around medical anecdotes, stories, cases that have come through. So how do we create a framework that's going to touch on, people are coming from traditional Shipibo healing, at the center. They're Westerners. They're receiving translation and Western support. And so how do we create a framework that's going to touch on traditional shamanism, spirituality, psychology, emotional health, neuroscience, human physiology, and biochemistry? You know, that's the idea, basically. That's what I'm involved in these people's care. So the book is about exploring psychospiritual medicine and the relationship between psychology, emotion, the physical body, and spirituality, and its stories of observed healings. So I'm just going to present in this, we have just a brief time here, the basic points, the basic points that I want to put forth. Obviously, this framework is not going to explain the entire phenomena of spiritual healing or ayahuasca shamanism, but these are some points that I want to put forth to contribute to the discussion and that are kind of fleshed out in the book. So first, spiritual well-being, what is considered spiritual well-being, at least within the Shipibo context and the Western context in which I live, is reflected in emotional health. So emotional health is something that's very kind of secular, widely accepted concept, and that's the tie-in to spiritual well-being and health. So now I'm going to present a little case, a depression case, to make my point. But this is where shamanism meets allopathic medicine at emotional health. All right, that's where the shaman and the doctor have a very easy time talking about things at our center for years, in fact. So our psychology is connected to our emotional body. So in the book, I'm putting forth the idea that the emotional body is real, that it is a physiologic reality that's currently being described by mind-body medicine research that has described the psycho-neuro-endocrine immunology network, the network that connects our mind and our psychology to centers in our brain, including the limbic brain, the emotional center in the brain, to the autonomic nervous system that's controlling the expression of our emotions and so many basic activities of our life, to the immune system and to the endocrine system, the hormone system. That's a network that's being described. An example of that network is the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is how stress hormones are produced. It's very researched right now in stress-related medical research. So I'm saying psychology is connected to our emotional body. The emotional body is real. It's a measurable phenomenon in Western medical science. And that this emotional body is subjectively connects us to the realm of spiritual energies. That we feel and we access the realm of spiritual energies through our emotional body, this emotional body that I'm saying we now can measure. Spiritual healing of mental and physical disease involves, so these are some of the steps I think that we observe, opening the mind to the heart, cleansing the emotional body, and transforming prior trauma, allowing ultimately for wider access to spiritual energies. So just briefly, case, this isn't in the book, this is just somebody from 2 weeks ago. I just came from Iquitos. We had a naturopathic medical student. So in our setting, people are in a traditional Shipibo vegetalista healing diet. So people are coming for 10 days or 2 weeks. In some cases, they're coming for months. In some cases, they're having repeated process over years. And in the book, I describe somebody had a one-night experience, somebody had a 2-week experience, somebody came for 6 months, and somebody who came repeated over years, and following them for years afterwards, to really try to understand what happens to people when they go home. So this lady, I don't have follow-up. I'm just presenting her as an interesting case. Like, how do we, as I follow her in the future, and if she continues to improve, it's curious to try to describe in biomedical terms, what happened to her. So she's got this history. She's a naturopathic medical student. She has this history of depression and suicidality. She was raised by a single alcoholic mother. She's very preoccupied by her mother's disease. Is she going to get sick? Is she going to, have a problem? Do I have to deal with it? She feels generally neglected and unloved throughout her life. So she had 4 ceremonies with us. The first ceremony, she was overwhelmed with physical symptoms, a lot of purging. She was basically out of it. She nearly fainted. Very sensitive to the medicine, dosed lightly, decides, I don't think I'm ever going to do that again. Continues in her diet. Next night, she doesn't drink, participates in the ceremony without drinking, being treated by the shamans, has some nice reflections, is feeling generally calmer, feels a little bit better. Next ceremony, she decides to take a little bit of ayahuasca, has some inspiring visions, gets more calm, more confident, and in the 4th ceremony, after this cleanse and this purging, she ends up having a breakthrough where she has a direct experience with the spirit of ayahuasca, which guides her through her mother's story. Shows her mother as a child. Her mother was hoping to be a mother her whole childhood. I can't wait to be a mom. That's my goal in life. I'm going to be a mom. has a child, has her as a little baby, so happy, such a wonderful mother, loving her life, so in her purpose. And then in her next pregnancy has a stillborn delivery. The doctor tells her it's probably related to some anxious tendencies you have, you know, starts to get kind of broken down, overwhelmed, and then she has another stillborn delivery. Now she's completely brokenhearted, and there's no real treatment for her. She falls into alcoholism, she begins to neglect her daughter, and that's the story. This access to this story, which did go along with, in fact, what happened to the mother, you know, opened the door for her to say, well, it's not my fault, and I have had a visceral experience of it not being my fault. I saw what happened, and now she starts opening the door to self-love and to a broader understanding, and she's back to school, and we'll see how she does. So I'll just present the few steps that I think, you know, that the book is trying to illuminate. You know, how do people heal through a process like that? I say first, you know, in order to heal emotionally and spiritually, one must overcome rigid and narrow thinking, which likely involves DMN dysfunction, default mode network dysfunction. This is like neuroscience research was presented earlier today, that psychedelic medicines have a tendency to open people's minds beyond their very limited thinking. And there is a problem with limited thinking in some of the major diseases that bring people down to Peru, for example, which is anxiety, depression, addiction. You know, PTSD are known to involve overactivity in certain regions of this brain network. So when that happens, our mind is closed to, we're just round and round, you know, in our same stuck reality that we can't see past. And when we can't see past it, we can't see through our senses, we can't come into the moment, and we can't feel what's inside of our bodies, our emotional bodies. We can't feel what's in our heart. And so, although limited thinking patterns can function as protective mechanisms, in the long run, they end up blocking us from unresolved past experiences and from our present feelings, limiting our access to the emotional body, which I'm saying is a real thing, this P&I network. So once we open our minds to our hearts, so if we, through a variety of things, whether it's meditation or possibly through a psychedelic experience or through an ayahuasca healing, our minds are open to our hearts, then we regain access to what we feel inside, okay, and to the world around us. And we come into the moment. And we become aware of what needs to be healed in the emotional body. And there's actually a decoupling of like the emotional brain and this other network that's suppressing a lot of memories and thoughts. So a lot of emotional things come forward, and sometimes traumatic memories that were buried start to come forward, and with the proper support, you know, we can help people through that stuff. So prior emotional traumas and unresolved emotional processes, which are being held in this emotional body I'm describing, later this awareness informs later healing processes. So as they go forward in their life, you know, maybe they decide I need to work on this healing this familial relationship with my mom. I think I need to go talk to my mom about what happened to her and see where that goes. So in spiritual healing, individuals gain mystical access and are sometimes shown how to love themselves in ways that they had not learned as a child. So now, this unresolved stress and emotional trauma that accumulates in the emotional body that I'm saying is being blocked off as we close our minds to our heart, this manifests in a process that's also measurable and being studied right now in modern research, which is, you know, emotional burden in the emotional body, which I'm saying is called allostatic load. It's a research world term in this P&I network, and that it's measured in a lot of these problems. So the energies and dynamic physiologic processes connected to unresolved stress and emotional trauma underline what is traditionally described as spiritual illness. So when we say somebody is soul sick, when the shaman says that person has an energetic problem, they have spiritual illness, we can look in this emotional body. We can look in this network and we can see stuff backed up in there. Unaddressed, these energies stay within us for decades. They turn into mental and physical illness. Through the spiritual processes of acceptance and forgiveness, these energies can be transformed through love. So that's the funny thing, is these soul-driven processes actually affect the physiology at this level, in this emotional body. And that's what's happening to these people. And what is love? We can say, okay, forgiveness, acceptance, but love, I'm saying love is the acceptance of all things as they are without reservation. So that's the consciousness that people come to, and that allows things to shift in their body, their physical body. These accumulated energies akin to allostatic load are reflected in epigenetic imprints in the P&I network, which store memories of emotional trauma and stress. So this is, you know, people have been talking about epigenetic imprints. It's been coming up. We don't have time to get into it, but it's a way that you get imprinted in your body, in the emotional body, in your memories, your emotional memories, in your cells. Just as this epigenetic software is influenced by stress and traumatic experience, this software can also be influenced by mystical experiences, including love, meditation, and in my hypothesis, shamanic icaros. Spirit meets biochemistry at the epigenetic level. Incidentally, psychotherapy, which relies on emotional connection and which is also immaterial in nature, has also been shown to promote healing by altering epigenetics. Spiritual healing, whether it involves shamanic plant medicine or other techniques, helps us to purge dysfunctional energies, maladaptive programs, I'm suggesting epigenetic programs, from our emotional body, which I'm saying is a real thing, and guides us to transform them through the faculties of the soul: self-love, forgiveness, compassion, and gratitude. In this process of emotional and spiritual healing, we gain further access to mystical experiences. Mystical experiences shape our sense of personal meaning and spiritual significance. They help us to open our minds further and connect to our hearts, allowing for further healing in the emotional body, inducing measurable improvements in the mind-body, i.e. the brain and the flesh. So the emotional body bridges the mind and body, and the heart is central to this entire apparatus, feeling, sensing emotions, and in fact, interacting with mystical energies once the person is prepared to do that. Embodied consciousness exists within a larger mystery beyond what our minds can understand. Paradoxically, access to this incomprehensible mystery is actually what allows us to make sense of things. Connection to the larger mystery gives us a sense of place and purpose in this life. This subjective connection to the boundless mystery experienced through the emotional/energy body is what we traditionally describe as faith. Spiritual well-being is reflected in emotional health. This is where shamanism meets allopathic medicine. Psychology is connected to our emotional body, which subjectively connects us to the realm of spiritual energies. Spiritual healing of the mental and physical disease involves opening the mind to the heart, cleansing the emotional body, and transforming prior trauma, allowing for wider access to spiritual energies. That's my talk. Thank you.
I'd just like to apologise to Adam for not allowing him any time for questions last time. So can I invite questions for both these speakers now, if you'd like to ask them any questions? Okay, I'd like to invite Jordan Sloshower to speak about plant medicines and psychiatry, critical paradigm integration.
Hey everyone, my name is Jordan Sloshower. I'm a resident in psychiatry and a medical doctor at Yale University in the US, and it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be speaking on this panel. My talk today is called Plant Medicines and Psychiatry, Critical Paradigm Integration Through a Model Clinic. And the background of this talk is this past year I've been organizing some psychedelic science activities at my university, as well as planning a psilocybin study for depression, attending psychedelic science conferences and seeing a lot of data being presented oriented towards the rescheduling of psychedelic substances, and a lot of momentum towards studying ayahuasca, and a lot less being presented on what things would actually look like if rescheduling were to take place. How could we actually integrate these psychedelic medicines and plant medicines into psychiatry, especially in a way, in a good way, in a responsible way, in a way that I think a lot of people at this conference would be in favor of, and that potentially would take into account critiques against psychiatry, which are common. And so I began this process of thinking about that, and would like to just share some very preliminary sort of ideas around three things. What would be some of the challenges, theoretical and methodological, in integrating plant medicines with psychiatry? What would be some of the main opportunities in doing so? And then just outlining very briefly some tenets of how this integration might actually look in a clinic, specifically again in a post-prohibition sort of context, as in an academic context as well.
using this idea that I'm calling critical paradigm integration. And so briefly, some challenges to integration. The first one, and this has been talked about a little bit, would be what I call divergent ontologies. And by this I refer to just different ways of conceptualizing and thinking about what plant medicines are, how they work, how they can be used. And so here I've just outlined that you could think about plant medicines from an indigenous or anthropological perspective, from a more spiritual, religious, or even New Age perspective, as psychological tools, and of course as biomedical or neurobiological entities, using terms from, and there's terms that represent each of these different paradigms. And I guess the way I've been thinking about these are in some ways different planes of knowledge in which on the one hand you might be able to talk about in this conference ayahuasca as the plant spirit, or different words like that to describe it. Whereas in the world of grants, where I'm trying to propose research, I would have to frame this as DMT, a serotonergic agonist combined with an MAOI inhibitor, resulting in brain changes and changes in neurochemistry. And so I'm basically just pointing out that there's a lot of discrepancy in those different ways of understanding the same entity. And where this becomes an issue, I think, is in a couple areas, like for instance, developing a coherent therapeutic narrative of how these medicines work. And so in the context of working with patients, colleagues, other doctors, and funding agencies, I find myself having to switch languages very, very quickly and being very tuned to who I'm talking to in terms of how to say what these medicines are and how they work. And so there's really, this is a very interesting activity to engage in, but it feels almost schizophrenic at times because it's so fragmented depending who you're talking to. And so you start wondering what are we actually even talking about? And then where this becomes practical is that depending on how you align yourself or conceive of these medicines would impact how you would design a therapeutic intervention. And so at Yale University, where I come from, there's been a lot of work on ketamine, which some of you might be familiar with for depression. And they very much framed ketamine in a strictly biological model, and then as a result of that, bring patients in, essentially administer them this medication or molecule without any real psychological support or any further intervention, and it's sort of seen as this magic bullet approach. And so I think there's a risk of, if we don't promote this kind of discussion, then we just produce evidence at the biomedical level that this could happen with plant medicines or psilocybin and other medicines. And so that's, in my mind, somewhat problematic, but also, as I'll talk about, an opportunity. And in here, I think one of the most interesting areas at this conference that I'd like to talk more about is how shamanism and shamans, how we'd be able to actually work with shamanism, how shamanism and psychiatry would be able to come together, especially, hearing Joe's work in Peru. Sounds like, it still would be tremendously challenging, but to actually do this, say, in a North American or European context at a major university, how to actually bring those worlds together is a question I'm really just thinking about, with, again, being aware of the risks of, or a balance between having to standardize a medicine that we're giving to some degree, while being acutely aware of the risks of biomedicalization and just appropriation. I attended this morning's dialogue with the Indigenous speakers and hearing their message very loud and clear about the risks of appropriation of Indigenous knowledge. And so really, how do we bridge these different worlds and concerns and try to be good healers is something I'm thinking a lot about. So on the flip side of challenges is opportunities. And so really, in my mind, it's the reverse of the challenges, in that we have these different ontologies that's supposed to say plant medicine there. And I think that psychedelic substances and plant medicines in particular provide us this tremendous opportunity to actually bridge different ways of knowing in a way that has not been done before, because they confront us immediately with aspects of all these different layers of experience. There's no way of hiding that plant medicine and psychedelic is operating on all these different levels, and we sort of need to reconcile this and think. And in doing that, I think the tremendous opportunity we have is, on the one hand, to advance scientific knowledge and then as well to advance scientific methods. Not only, for instance, in thinking about things like the emotional body, that's a great term that isn't, currently widely accepted, but we're starting to see research oriented around illuminating the aspects of the human experience that haven't been traditionally part of medicine. And then studies like Robin Carhart-Harris's work connecting neurobiology with mystical experience and subjective experience of psychedelics. And so connecting those different layers of understanding I was alluding to earlier is something we're starting to see out of the field of psychedelic science, and that I want to continue to promote. Of course, opportunities to develop new treatments is why a lot of us are interested in this field, but especially this idea, in my mind, not just the treatment itself, but a whole new model of psychiatry that would be oriented towards using these medicines in a coherent way that makes sense of these different layers of understanding. Of course, I'm trying to pack in a lot into one speech, but I could be happy to go into those afterwards. Training new cohort of therapists in that type of modality, and maybe controversially, but I think if done correctly, that this kind of paradigm could promote social and environmental justice and human rights. And so seeing all these different opportunities in integrating plant medicines and psychiatry, I just briefly was thinking about what would a model clinic look like that was at least oriented towards trying to achieve some of these opportunities. And I sort of was encouraged to put a label on it, and I called it critical, that the ethos of this kind of a clinic would be critical paradigm integration. And by that, there's a few tenets that I would just briefly propose. The first of which is multimodality and interdisciplinary collaboration, by which I'm referring to a model that respects and incorporates principles and practices from different traditions and paradigms, flexibly and creatively combining theoretical, diagnostic, and therapeutic approaches from them with the aims of deepening our understanding of patient suffering and delivering safer, more effective treatments. And so this interdisciplinarity and multimodality would be applied both at the level of theory, clinical formulation, and treatment planning. So at the level of theory, thinking in a complex way, drawing from different fields and theories about our patients, their suffering, and what actually heals them. Clinical formulation I sort of refer to as diagnosis. I'm referring to diagnosis, so having different kinds of providers, from a psychedelic psychotherapist who might do an intake screening and then determine with a patient who else would be needed to help formulate the person's problem, whether it would be a psychiatrist, a shaman, a naturopathic doctor, a yoga instructor. The possibilities are open there. And then together with that interdisciplinary team and the patient, come up with a treatment plan that would make sense to address that person, that may or may not include psychedelic medicines or plant medicines. And then the tenet of treatment integration. This is sort of a hot thing in the field of psychedelic science right now, but we're just referring to an emphasis on whatever sort of therapeutic treatments might be proposed to actually make sure that we provide services, sort of wraparound services, in-home services, to make sure that people can connect the treatment, the healing that they undergo from plant medicines in their everyday life, and continue to provide follow-up for patients. The next part of critical paradigm integration is this emphasis on knowledge generation and transfer across or between paradigms. And so in this, I see, on the one hand, having a research agenda as part of the clinic, and this could be open, certainly some amount of collecting data on what we're actually doing and treating. So that would be more like outcomes-oriented research, but then potentially further research that would be oriented towards connecting these different layers of understanding, the different ontologies that I referred to earlier. And in order to do this, and this touches on the last tenet of critical perspective and self-reflexivity, really I'd envision this kind of clinic as an open container that promotes critical dialogues, is self-reflexive in what we're doing. This is going to be very controversial in bringing together plant medicine and psychiatry and psychedelics moving forward, but I think it's going to happen, and we're going to have to be open to hearing critiques from different parties, and if our center can actually be a place that hosts and welcomes those dialogues, brings together psychiatrists and shamans or all sorts of different people and promote education and training, I think that would be a good way to go rather than just having a more closed-minded perspective. And so just sort of wrapping up, the structure of this sort of clinic would likely be outpatient with the ability to hold longer weekend retreats or longer, so some residential stay. And as I've already touched on, just would have clinical practice with patients, research, which would generate knowledge and evidence. There'd be components of education and training. And then funding is a whole nother topic, but any clinic through these activities, we'd need to generate funding in a way that would promote the clinical practice and research, hopefully in an equitable way to promote the healing of the most number of people that we could. So just in summary, I've presented a model research clinic that would treat patients with plant medicines and complementary treatment modalities in a manner that A, respects and incorporates principles and practices from different traditions and paradigms, and B, fosters the knowledge generation and transfer from across paradigms. This kind of critical paradigm integration would employ interdisciplinary collaboration and reflexive critique in conjunction with contemporary scientific methods to attempt to unify various ways of understanding plant medicines and other integrative modalities and begin to elucidate best practices for treating various conditions in this integrative fashion. I know I covered a lot of different things in a short amount of time, and there's tons of fundamental questions, I think, left unanswered. But I'm hoping to continue this work in the future with my career, and I invite questions and discussion throughout this week with all of you to further this vision. Thank you very much. And if anyone's interested, the Yale Psychedelic Science Group is, we host some seminars, and we're at the yalepsg.org.
Thank you, Jordan. Did you ask a question? Would anyone like to ask Jordan any questions about that fascinating talk? Dennis?
Is there a microphone? Oh, okay. Well, I think great presentation. I think your aspirations are admirable, but what you're proposing to integrate plant medicines into biomedical psychiatry, I think it's going to be a huge challenge, because biomedical psychiatry is essentially a subdivision of the pharmaceutical industry right now. And they're not going to be happy with this proposal, because they would rather sell their more or less ineffective medicines, and you're proposing to completely overturn that paradigm. It seems like the challenges are almost insurmountable. How is this going to happen, given the power structure and the way that biopsychiatric medicine is currently structured and controlled, and essentially married to the pharmaceutical industry, which has far more influence in biomedicine, much more money? I mean, so what, this is a beautiful vision. How can you make it real?
It's a great question. So the world of psilocybin research is further ahead than ayahuasca research, and there has been some discussion around where is waiting for the pushback from big pharma in the psilocybin, because it is going to be bad business, because we're proposing treating people with conditions with limited numbers of sessions, essentially deprescribing their medications, and then treating them. I haven't heard much of the pushback yet from pharma in that realm. And it's been interesting to see, I really didn't know would I even be able to begin this agenda at somewhere like Yale University, but the chair of our department has opened his mind to at least psilocybin research. I've made my intentions around ayahuasca research known and have not received much pushback and actually some encouragements so far. So I totally agree that this might take me my whole life, but
Sorry, is there time for another one?
Yeah, one question. Sorry, the gentleman beside Dennis.
Okay, this is actually related to what you said, which is you mentioned integrating people like a yoga instructor and a shaman, but these are people with, it relates to environmental justice or social justice, very different power places in the structure. So, is my insurance going to pay for a shaman to be part of a system that then is going to, who knows, somebody who has an MD, right, who's prescribing a medication? So how do you propose actually resolving the power differential sort of societally between all of these different sorts of players?
I mean, I definitely agree that what I propose isn't even close to on the brink of immediate reality. But it certainly was, as I said, wanting to propose, in a way, set what would an ideal vision sort of look like in this field. And I do think, for instance, there's been a lot of research tying, say, meditation and altered states of consciousness with research on psychedelic science. And so it would be very logical, for instance, to include ongoing meditation after psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy. And again, I was thinking that the research component here, that we need to do outcomes-oriented research so that your insurance company down the road would actually pay for that if we can show that it's effective. So that's where I do see the research agenda as being important in collecting data on what we would be doing, so that this wouldn't just be available to people who have a lot of money who can pay out of pocket, essentially.
Jordan?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, time marches on. Please continue this discussion after the session, but now I'd like to invite Jerónimo Mazarrasa to talk about ayahuasca, tourism versus tradition.
Thank you very much. It looks, I hope, not too problematic. This is basically feel well. It's actually the case. I've been giving different versions of this talk for now 10 years, and it's basically an ongoing reflection that is very much a personal reflection. It's the product of a series of encounters, a series of personal encounters, and a process of making sense of myself, for myself, of this notion of basically, I should say, a strange sort of fascination for when things go wrong. And I'm especially fascinated for things go wrong in terms of intercultural encounters. And in my case, the encounters between, Western or North Atlantic, white, you can call it many things depending on your people, and indigenous or indigenous people or shamans in general. No, it's really not working. I think it's an older version of PowerPoint. One second. It's not going to work. Nope. I'm going to have to do it without it. No tenéis un Mac, ¿no? No, es que da igual. You go ahead and I'll work something out. Okay. Sí, sí, exacto. Listo. Thank you.
Sure you, Jerónimo will be back. But now I'd like to introduce Paulo Cesar Ribeiro Barbosa, talking about psychological and neuropsychological assessment of regular Ayahuasca users.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to present today research I conduct in New Mexico with União do Vegetal. It's a psychological and neuropsychological assessment of regular Ayahuasca users. It was just published in Comprehensive Psychiatry just recently. It was a collaboration between my university, Universidade Estadual de Santa Cruz, in Ilhéus, na Bahia, University of New Mexico, where I did my postdoc, coordenação de aperfeiçoamento de pessoal de nível superior, e PROAD from Unifesp. All right. Okay. This is the basic design of the study. Basically, I compared UDV Ayahuasca users with active Catholic and Protestant subjects from Albuquerque area. So these groups are compared across religiosity measures, alcohol and drug use, impulsivity, quality of life, personality and mood. We also compare these groups across some neuropsychological function, including attention, executive function, and memory. Whenever we found the difference between the groups, we run extra analysis. Sorry, what? Put down. Okay, sorry. Whenever we found difference between the groups, we run extra analysis to assess the potential effect of Ayahuasca attendance rituals in this difference. For instance, if we found some difference in a specific trait of personality trait between UDV and control, we run further analysis to check if there is some relationship, association between life attendance of Ayahuasca rituals or attendance of Ayahuasca rituals during the previous 12 months. This is the basic inclusion criteria of the study. We had 30 subjects from UDV. They had to be active members and had to attend the UDV sessions regularly. And the control groups, we also had to be active members of Protestant or Catholic communities from Albuquerque. During the time of the assessment, we asked the volunteers from UDV not to take ayahuasca for at least 6 days before the evaluation. Exclusion criteria for the control group was the use of ayahuasca. If someone of potential candidate from Catholic or Protestant communities had any experience with ayahuasca, they were not evaluated at all. Also, the control group had to be matched on age, gender, and socio-demographic profile with UDV study participant. Both groups were required not to refrain from caffeine, tobacco, or any stimulant, at least in our previous day evaluation. And also, they have to refrain alcohol during the day of neuropsychological evaluation or in the day before. This is some of the results. We had 16 male in UDV and 14 female. 14 female in the control group and 14 female in the control group. Basically, this is from control group. This is the religious affiliation distribution. We had 11 Catholics, 13 Protestants, and 3 subjects from we recruit from Unitarian Universalist Church. This table shows the match, the income and educational level. The groups are very well matched. You can see there are no basic major difference between the groups. So in age, the median of UDV group was 42.5 and control 45 years old. And education, UDV had 16 years of education against 18 years of education of the control group. And you can see also the income in dollars, annual income in dollars were very close between both groups. We also collect very detailed data of attendance to ayahuasca rituals. 5? 10, okay. We also collected detailed information on ayahuasca attendance rituals and Catholic masses and Protestant service. So this is the median of ayahuasca attendance during the previous 12 months, 30, minimum of 20 and maximum of 62. The control groups, the median was 45 and minimum was 6 sessions, 6 masses or services during the previous months and a maximum of 306. All right. So this is the lifetime attendance of ayahuasca sessions. We collect data on how many ayahuasca sessions they attended during their lifetime. So median was 190, minimum of 20, and maximum of 1,000 sessions. We also collected from UDV group the attendance during the previous 12 months. And the median was 60, and with a minimum was 12 times during the previous 12 months, and a maximum of 192 during the previous 12 months. The Duke University Religious Index measures 3 dimensions of religiosity. The first is organizational religious activity, which means public religious service, like attendance service and public meetings, etc. The second dimension is the non-organizational religious activity. It's about the private religious activities, like praying in home or watching a religious show in home, meditation in home, etc. The intrinsic religiosity is the third dimension assessed by this scale. And it measures the feeling of the presence of God and a personal commitment to apply religious principle in daily life. The only difference we found between the groups in this measure was the first one in the organizational religious activity, in which the UDV score less than the controls. This is kind of expected because Protestant and Catholics, they held services and masses 4 times a month, while UDV regular sessions are held twice a month. The Addiction Severity Index measures regular alcohol and other psychoactive substance use. So it measures the past month use and lifetime use. By past month use, we mean recent use, is how many times, how many days subjects use the substance during the previous 30 days. Lifetime use means how many years the subject may use the substance at least twice a week for at least a year. So there was a huge difference here. Only 2 subjects from UDV had used alcohol during the previous 30 days against 16 members of the control group. Alcohol lifetime is the inverse. So we have more UDV subjects using alcohol on a regular basis in the past against 21 UDV subjects against 14 subjects from the control group. Alcohol to intoxication during the previous month, we had only 1 subject in UDV against 2 subjects from the control group. Alcohol to intoxication means a person who drinks until get drunk. Alcohol to intoxication lifetime on a regular basis, people who drink on a regular basis until get drunk, in UDV was 16 subjects in the past use, lifetime use, against 5 subjects from the control groups. And in cannabis lifetime, we found 20 subjects from UDV who made past use of cannabis during lifetime against 6 subjects from the control group. The impulsivity Barat impulsivity scale measures 3 dimensions of impulsivity. The first one is attentional, 5. The tendency to make quick decisions. The second one is motor, the tendency to act without thinking. And the third one is non-planning, which is a lack of forethought. We found no difference between the groups across these measures. And the quality of life, the SF36 questionnaire measures 8 domains of quality of life. The first one of physical functioning. The second one is role limitations due to physical health, which means how much a person is dysfunctional due to physical health. And the third one is the role limitations due to emotional problems, which means how much a person is impaired due to emotional problems. And the fourth one is energy fatigue. We have also emotional well-being, social functioning, pain, and general health. The UDV group scored better than the controls in the role limitations due to physical health. So they were less impaired by physical problems than the control group. The personality trait, the big 5 personality trait measures scale measures 5 domains of personality. The first one is extroversion, which means the tendency to be outgoing and energetic. The second one is agreeableness, which is the tendency to be compassionate and cooperative. The third one is conscientiousness, the tendency to show self-discipline and act dutifully. The fourth, neuroticism, a tendency to experience unpleasant emotions such as anger and anxiety. And finally, openness is a tendency to be inventive and appreciative, appreciate art and unusual ideas. And the UDV score higher than controls in agreeableness. So according to this instrument, the UDV group had more tendency to be compassionate and cooperative than the control group. And also they score higher than the controls in the domain of openness, which means that they have a greater tendency to be inventive and appreciate art and unusual ideas. The profile of mood states measures 6 domains of mood: depression, anger, vigor, tension, fatigue, and confusion. And we found the difference between UDV and controls in depression. the UDV did better in depression. They were less depressed than the controls. And in confusion, they were less confused than the controls. Finally, this is a kind of, this is the first, the initiation of neuropsychological testing. The first one is the trail-making test, which assesses scanning, sequencing, switching, and flexibility. It consists of two parts. The first part, the subject is asked to connect these numbers in ascending order, 1, 2, 3, etc. And the score is based on how many seconds they take to complete the sequence. And the part B, the subject is asked to alternate between letters and numbers and letters in ascending order. So we ask them to connect 1A, 2B, and so on. So, and we found no difference between this test and between the groups in this test. This TROOP is a measure that assesses inhibition, cognitive flexibility, and selective attention. It has 3 parts. The third part, we ask subjects to read 100 stimulus. The stimulus are words, red, green, blue. There are 100 stimulus, and the score is based on how many words they can read within 45 seconds. The trial one is similar. They have to name the color instead. They have to name the color, so green, blue, and red. It also has 100 stimulus, and the score is based on how many stimulus they can read in 45 seconds. And the trial 3, the words are printed in congruent colors. So you can see here, red is printed in green, blue is printed, green is printed in blue, and blue is printed in red. So this we also we ask subjects to say the color instead of read the word. This is the most important task of STROOP because it assesses the inhibition of habitual response. Já? What can I do now? Okay. So we found no difference between these groups in this test either. I'm going to skip so we can have time for a few questions, right? So this is the summary of the major findings. The UDV group had a great past use of alcohol to intoxication. Also, UDV group had greater past use of cannabis, but UDV group has less recent of alcohol use. And they had also, UDV group also had lower level depression, lower level of confusion, and they had greater scores on personality traits regarding prosocial and aesthetic sensitivity attitudes. Basically, no difference between the groups were found across the neuropsychological tests, except the one that I skipped, that basically measured the finding was that UDV was the memory of UDV people were less vulnerable to interference. And basically, lifetime use of ayahuasca was positively associated with this domain of quality of life, which is role limitation due to physical health. Thank you. This is my contact.
Any questions? So once again, this is Jerónimo Mazarrasa. I don't have your title. Ayahuasca Tourism versus Tradition.
Okay, that That's the best I can do. It's an emergency PDF. Let me see if it. Yeah, it passes, and you can see it. Oh, there you go. Good enough. Like I said, I've been giving different versions of this talk for now more than 10 years. Not for any other particular reason, but because it's a topic that I have personally been forced to think about for now 10 years, and this is sort of a updated version of a talk I gave in, I think, 2005 or 2006 in the first Shamanism conference in Iquitos. And it's just an update of on the same series of ideas that have to do with a number of realizations that I came to on the topic of the encounter between, well, myself and indigenous people, but really I think the value of it is that a lot of it applies to more than myself, and that's the reason why I share these insights with you. This all started because 15 years ago I started on a documentary project with a Canadian partner, Mark, and we had a plan to make a series of documentaries about master plants or teacher plants or plantas maestras. The idea was that we were going to do one documentary per plant, and we were interested in the traditional indigenous use of these plants and the relationships of indigenous people to the plants themselves. So this was basically the starting point. Mark had already spent some time living with the Huichols in Mexico and studying their peyote use, and he had also been in Oaxaca studying mushrooms. And when I joined him, our first trip was to Mexico. We went to Huautla de Jimenez. You might be familiar with this story. It's at this point sort of a very famous place in psychedelic history because it's where Maria Sabina lived. Maria Sabina is a well-known Mexican shaman that was the first person to share mushrooms with Gordon Wasson, who later went on to write a book. And this was very much the beginning of a series of events that happened during the 60s, having to do with the rediscovery by Westerners of basically the indigenous views of these plants. That means basically that the Westerners had been aware that there were Indians taking, in this case, mushrooms in this village, in Huautla de Jimenez. When we arrived, at this point, it had been more than 50 years since white people had been aware of that. And very quickly, we found the results of this. The results was that the entire place, sort of a booming tourist industry had grown around this, the commerce of this, in this village, to the point that, well, the taxis had a drawing of Maria Sabina on the door. Every taxi in town had it. There was the taxi stop was called Maria Sabina. There was an entire network of youth hostels that catered to young, more or less hippie travelers that came to try this. And as soon as we got off the bus, and this was 4 in the morning, we were offered mushrooms and and sessions with shamans. As we were walking out of the bus, different people were coming offering this to us. So this was not in our idealized minds. This was not what we were looking for. We were looking for the real thing, right? So we went much further, several valleys away from Huautla de Jimenez, until we found this man, Don Eligio, who took us for quite a night with ololuiki seeds, which are this blue flower, which they contain a precursor to LSD. That was the first time that I took any of these plants with an indigenous shaman. And what happened was that I had a horrible night because I became completely blocked because the Don Eligio he was singing and then he would stop singing and he would look at me and he said, "Now, Jerónimo, it's your turn to ask God for what you need." And this, in my very confused state of highly psychedelic state, this caused a waterfall of thoughts and confusion having to do with what was I going to ask and what did I have the right to ask and who was I doing talking to God when I never talked to God in the first place. And this very, very confusing thoughts that kept me completely locked. I couldn't say anything. He would give up on me, go back and sing it, and then again he would say, "Come on, what are you going to ask? It's your turn." And I just... This turned into not just a mental sort of lock, not just a mental knot, but somehow a physical knot where my back began to hurt. And it was awful. It was awful, and it just got worse and worse and worse. It became really, really painful physically. And then in the middle of this struggle, I suddenly realized that I knew what I wanted to ask for, and I was ready to speak. And I said, "Help!" And yeah, very quickly, the man came and they began to, I can't describe what they did. Him and his son, they were pressing in different places, they were singing, they were hitting, I don't know. It came, at that point, I really realized I didn't know what was happening. I really didn't know what was happening. But I had a feeling that they knew what they were doing. So I remember very clearly that I had this thought that I'm just going to give up. I'm just going to put myself in their hands. And at this point, I felt very, very stupid. I felt very stupid about my documentary. I felt very stupid about the questions that I've been asking them before. I realized to which degree my ignorance was abysmal. I'd come to this place with having read a number of things and having thought a number of things and having imagined a number of things that I was going to find. But I really had no clue, and I was only beginning to be shown what this was all about. This, for me, was the beginning of a long series of realizations about just how wrong I'd been about so many things. And this is some of what I want to share with you today. This is the product of continuing documentary, meeting more places, meeting more indigenous people, traveling more, but also of a lot of reading, a lot of research, and a lot of anthropology, and reading the works of a lot of people who have thought about these encounters, intercultural encounters in a much more orderly and profound way than myself. So the main problem, basically, and this is supposed to be a saying from some Jewish rabbi, though I haven't been able to find it. The main problem is that we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. This is what the Jewish saying says. So when I was going, looking at indigenous people, and I thought I was looking at indigenous people, I wasn't really seeing indigenous people. What I was seeing was what I thought indigenous people were. This is because when we look at something that we don't know, we don't see what's in front of us. We see our own ignorance reflected back at us, or our own ideas, our own preconceptions, this is the first thing that pops up, something recognizable. I will give you a few examples. Shamanism. Now, this is the Dalai Lama on one side. On the other side, I can't say his name right, is Schlauber. He was the German Minister of Economy. Now, a couple of years ago, I was in Greece, where I met a number of dogs called Schlauber. The Greeks very much hate Schlauber. They think this man was hell-bent on destroying Greek economy and sending the country in doom. They think he's a very evil man. However, in Germany, many people think that Schlauber is actually looking for their best interest. And he was doing the right thing, and he was trying to keep a group of, disorderly, chaotic economy from sort of, corrupting and making trouble for innocent people. Now, shamans are a lot closer to this than to the image that we have of the Dalai Lama. Shamans are not only responsible for taking care for the sick people in their community, but are also responsible for defending their community from the attacks of outsiders, on the attacks of other people. Shamans, at least in South America, and the ones that I've encountered with very often, are deeply ambiguous figures. Now, we believe, because we read a number of books, that it's going to be like this. It's going to be like the Dalai Lama. It's going to be a person that is a spirit, not just a doctor or a healer, but also a spiritual leader, some person who's somehow enlightened, some person who's full of good. And although you will find some people like that, you will find a lot of people that are closer to Xiaobe, people who have actually, a job that also includes not just taking care of their people, but also defending them. So, I found that I had a very, very nearsighted, very, very shortened, very, very, very narrow vision of what shamanism was and what it meant. Community. This first picture is a picture from a rainbow gathering. I don't know if you are familiar with it, if you know what it is. It's sort of a Burning Man, but without electricity. But basically, groups of hippies camp out in the woods, and they spend a month there camped out, and there's no money, and it's a fantastic time. I've gone a number of them, also with my children. I really enjoy them. Now, in the rainbow gatherings, they do these sort of circles, and songs are sung, and you see that there's a teepee. There's a lot of, and the people call each other family, and they speak of the tribe. There is a lot of, at least there's a discourse around the rainbow gathering that somehow this is similar to Indigenous. This is similar to this other thing. This is a Hopi dance. It's a picture from the 40s. It's an Indigenous dance. This is sort of what I was projecting to. I thought a tribe was sort of like this. Where I was wrong is that, I read the works of these anthropologists, and she said that, anthropologists and sociologists have fought over the definition of community for decades, if not hundreds of years on. I won't go into that, but basically one of my favorite ones was by this anthropologist, and she said, community are the group of people that you're born into that you didn't choose. That's your community. A tribe is the opposite of a group of like-minded fellows. A tribe is a lot closer to your family. Now, you choose your friends. You don't choose your family. Indigenous people don't choose their tribe. They don't choose their neighbors. And they can't easily leave them. So you understand that the type of relationship is very different from the relationship that I was imagining from my hippie days, rainbow gathering, a group of like-minded fellows in a fellowship of common interests. No, what you got is something that is a lot closer to family. And then you understand that these rituals that create, increase, make visible their connection, then you realize the importance of these things, in a sense that is very, very different from what I was imagining. Nature. Now, because we come from a highly technological culture, our general feeling is that we are a danger to nature, that we might destroy nature. So we might destroy with our pollution, with the nuclear, bam, 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 bam. No, with global warming. So generally, we feel that nature is like a dove that we must protect, and we must be ecological. We must we must throw less trash. Our feeling is that nature is in danger, and we are the predators. But for most indigenous people, especially in the past, and certainly for most agriculturists, the feeling is the opposite. The feeling is that nature might destroy you. If things go wrong, if the crops don't feed you, if too much water falls, if too little water falls, there are so many things that nature can do to you to basically end your life, either by starvation or whatever. And this is something that we often ignore. We like to talk, for example, a lot about Pachamama, and we ignore the fact that right next to Pachamama, there's Pachacurri, which is the other side of that same figure, of that same mother, which is endlessly hungry for blood rituals, for payments, and for this. So very often the relationship of indigenous people to nature is not like, oh, dear Mother Nature, we love you, give us more, but here's some food, please don't kill me. Please let me keep living. Now, it's a very, very, and I'm very sorry because as you realize, I'm making wide, sweeping generalizations about any of these things that you could talk about for ages. Necessarily, because of time, I'm doing this. I realize all of this is, not exactly like this. I'm making it, but I think the idea is clear enough. The social reality of indigenous people. Now, we like to think, or we tend to think that, or we would love to think that indigenous people live like this, in a place with tipis and, some sort of traditional community, close to nature, with a wise, kind shaman overlooking everything. But these are some pictures from a Pine Ridge Reservation in the United States. This is the everyday reality of Lakota people, and this is if, as you know, there is something that is not known is that there has been now for a number of years an epidemic of teenage suicides in indigenous reservations in the United States, where you get something like 47 kids killing in suicide packs, where like you get 3-4 kids at a time committing suicide, teenagers, 47 of them in just 2 years in one of the numbers I have now. If this had been white kids, there would have been an incredible outrage about this. Now, I think that if you are participating in a sweat lodge, if you are calling for Taganga, if you're smoking at Chanupa, if you're participating in any sort of Lakota spirituality tinged and that's absolutely wonderful. But if you're not aware that this is the reality of indigenous, that this is the reality of Lakota people, I think somehow you're not being fair. You're not getting the whole story, and you're choosing to look the other way, and you're choosing to look what you want to see, and not the actual everyday reality of most indigenous people throughout the Americas. No? Last but not least, religion. We come from a tradition of proselytistic religions. That means that Christians went out of their way to convert everybody to Christianity, and of course, thankfully, mostly we don't do that anymore. But we have kept a certain idea, and it's the idea that somehow religions are interchangeable. That is, that you might have one religion, but then you might choose another religion if that feels closer to your heart. No? The way first we try to convince people, and now we don't do that anymore, but we still believe that religion is something that you can change, it's something that you can choose. Now, this is very, very different from indigenous spirituality, because indigenous spirituality is not something you choose, it's an expression of who or what a people are. Now, it would be completely ridiculous, for example, for a Lakota person to try to convince an indigenous person of another tribe to join their religion. That's not how it works. Perhaps the only example, or the example that is close enough for us to sort of understand, would be some Orthodox Jewish sects. Now, we understand that this is something, I'm finishing. We understand that this is something, it's not that you cannot join an Orthodox Jewish sect, it's that it's not something that you can join easily. And it's because it's not just a matter of believing certain things. It's what is your lifestyle, what is your community, who you live with, who you grow up next to. All of these things are included, no, in being part of these communities. I have to finish, but this is the last one, no? Is it okay if I go a little bit longer? Yeah, I don't rush. Okay, it'll only be 10 minutes more. The other question that was for me like really that really made me think a lot is the question of who benefits. For this, for me, it was absolutely key reading a passage in a book by anthropologist Michael Taussig, who teaches at Columbia, fantastic guy. And he wrote a book called Diario de una Limpia, which is not an anthropology book, but it's just a diary as he goes back to Colombia and he visits some of his old friends. And he's writing what happens. And what happens is that his friends are caught in the middle of this warfare between the paramilitaries and the guerrilla. And what happens is that you're screwed whatever you do. The guerrilla comes and they ask for food, and if you don't give them food, they kill you. You know, and if you give them food, they let you go. And then the paramilitary comes and say, who gave food to the guerrillas? And then if you give food to the guerrillas, they kill you. And if they don't, so you're screwed either way. And he's describing this situation, you know, and he's trying to make sense of it. He's going back into the history of these movements in Colombia. How could it happen? Why? And he comes to a point and he says, look, it doesn't make any sense. Terror has its own dynamic. You cannot make sense of it. What happens here, it's awful, it's appalling. And the worst part of it is that the worse it is what happens here, the better it is for me personally, because the more important it is that I write this book. Now, that was the first time in my life that I realized, you know, that I saw somebody realize that somehow you can even benefit out of other people's disgrace by being the one who denounces it. No? Here I am. You know, I'm getting benefits from this. I'm standing in this desk. Everybody's listening to me. No, I get to feel good for myself because I get to talk about all of these awful things that happen. In reality, I'm benefiting from all of this. I was benefiting from the documentary. What are the benefits that I've gotten out of ayahuasca, that I've gotten out of these plants? Well, I mean, I've gotten great personal healing. You know, I got to make, you know, a couple of films. I get to stand up and talk to people and be applauded afterwards. You know, there's a lot of benefits. Now, how did the indigenous people who gave me these plants benefited? You know, how did they benefit? Well, you know, I obviously paid them for their services. I paid them very generously, I believe. I was very generous from my heart, and I did wanted to pay them, you know. But these things, you see what I'm saying, no? There's a deep asymmetry in these relationships. And there's not much you can do about this except being painfully aware of the nature of what is going on. No?
Just so you know, there is a movie starting outside by the lake at 6 o'clock, which is imminent.
So anyway, this is basically a very quick summary of the type of things that I've been thinking about for 10 years now. In terms of final words, you know, I took this writing course, and we were all writing stories, and then we were critiquing each other's stories. And the teacher always told us, you know, you shouldn't, when somebody reads their story, you should never say, I didn't like this or I didn't like that about the story, because that people feel attacked and then they don't react well. You should always say, if this was my story, I would do it like this, you know. So if this was my story, you know, the way that I would rewrite the nature of these encounters is that I would make people a lot more aware of this, a lot more aware of the asymmetric nature of these things, a lot more aware of who benefits, a lot more aware of the mutual projections that are at play, and a lot more aware that the ideal It's not that you go and you meet some indigenous people and they heal you. The ideal is that this interchange is reciprocal. What I mean by reciprocal is that it goes both ways. It's not that you go to some indigenous people and you're sick and they heal you. It's that the way they take your problems, you should at one point or another, at one level or another, also make their problems yours. Then you're starting to build something that resembles reciprocality. Because indigenous people have big problems, you know, and they're problems that, you know, in a certain sense, we have equipment, we have tools we can help with. But it's a matter of just being aware of these things. So thank you very much, and I'll be around if you want to ask some questions.
Any immediate questions for Jerónimo? Okay, I'd like to thank all our panelists very much for some wonderful talks this afternoon, and suggest we give them another round of applause.